So we've had civic thought, or we will have civic thought. We've had civic curricula, civic bargains, civic dialogue, and civic partisanship. So going back to the earlier conversation about what precedes what, so knowledge and thought, maybe that precedes action. I'm delighted to introduce and moderate this last panel of the day. In particular, I'm delighted because the central suggested reading was by Ben and Jenna Storey. Jenna's not able to be with us today, but Ben is here trying to fill out both sides of the couple to describe the paper that Ben and Jenna had put out almost 2 years ago exactly today?
We published the paper in December 21st.
Okay.
So it's about 18 months.
Yeah, so getting to 2 years. And there was a project of creating the paper, and I'm happy to say that I've learned a lot from reading the paper, rereading the paper, having conversations about it, and I think we'll have a robust conversation on this panel of people agreeing and hopefully disagreeing with some of the claims made by Ben and Jenna. So Ben is a senior fellow in social, cultural, and constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Scott Carroll is professor in the Department of Economics and Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs in the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas, Austin. Roosevelt Montaz is an incoming John and Margaret Bard Professor in Liberal Education and Civic Life at Bard College. Russell Moorhead is the Robert Clements Professor of Democracy and Politics and co-director of the Political Economy Project at Dartmouth, and he's also a member of the House of Representatives in New Hampshire, representing the 12th District. Maybe he'll talk about that, maybe not. Maybe that's something we do over cocktails. Sandra is the Dean and E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Professor in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies in the University of Richmond. And you all received the suggested reading or saw the link to it. And there were a couple of guiding questions that Jeremy had put forward to us for the panel. Should there be a new discipline of, quote, civic thought? How would civic thought be distinguished from existing disciplines and established interdisciplinary programs? I'm looking forward to their answers or challenges to the questions because it's something that we face in setting up the Chase Center. Questions come up very often in that area, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. Ben will start off with 10 or 15 minutes, and then each of the other panelists will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions and comments and discussion. Ben, take her away.
Okay, well, let me start by just thanking Lee and the staff here at the Chase Center for putting together a really marvelous day, down to the smooth jazz that was playing from the speaker system to bring us back into the room. This is pro level stuff. But you all have put together really a wonderful program, and I've learned a ton from what I have heard today. So I'm going to make an argument on the basis of a paper that Jenna and I wrote 18 months ago, and on some of the things we've learned since. That paper would be different if I started to write it tomorrow because I learned a lot over the course of today, and I would love to incorporate all of those things. And that paper itself emerged from conversations with some of the people in this room, and so. I think Jenna and I first came across the term civic thought thanks to Brian Garston. And then we sort of had conversations with the deans and directors of the new schools, what we call now the new schools of civic thought, and sort of settled on that term. I can remember the two Toms from the Jack Miller Center and Josh Dunn and Lee Strang were all present for some of those conversations. And what Jenna and I tried to do was just write up the idea and see whether it had legs. And what we found in the intervening 18 months is that it seems to. And so let me just make a case for why I think civic thought ought to be a discipline. I'll make that case in about 7 points. So I think the mode of thinking characteristic of a citizen or civic thought is a form of intelligence that deserves to be cultivated at the highest levels of the university. That's what universities do. They cultivate particular forms of human intelligence, including everything from engineering to the writing of poetry. Civic thought seems to me to be a distinctive form of intellectual excellence with the things that make for a discipline or a field of inquiry. It's got a characteristic scope. It's got a particular approach. It's got the sorts of skills that constitute a discipline. And it seems to me in this regard to deserve a place on a par with all the other kinds of intellectual excellence that the university cultivates. So here's my 7-point explanation of that argument. So why does civic thought deserve to be a discipline? First, because thinking like a citizen is demanding. That is, it addresses a serious human problem. What is it to be a citizen? To be a citizen is to exercise a share of sovereignty. Sovereignty means the most comprehensive kind of political responsibility. So how should we prepare ourselves for that? That seems to me to be a major human question. And we can see how significant the problem of citizenship is if we consider the historical record of human projects of self-government. And that record is checkered at best. Josh Ober gave us something of a picture of this earlier, but just to cite the major examples, Athens burned brightly but briefly. Romans republicans eventually kneeled before the Caesars. Modern European efforts at self-government have given us a sort of terrifying parade of spectacles that stretch from the guillotine to the gulag. And everybody's worried about the fate of American self-government right now. So there's no reason whatsoever to assume that self-government is even possible. That's what I mean by saying that this is a significant human problem that we're trying to address. So why does the effort of human beings to govern themselves so often fail? We can begin to see why when we just think about the intellectual magnitude of what citizens are called upon to make judgments about. So even in such a system of ours, where we delegate political power to officials at many different levels of government, ultimate sovereignty remains with citizens. And to exercise that sovereign responsibility well is to be a competent judge over a vast range of questions. Where, for example, should the line between religion and politics be drawn? When should the nation make war? When should it seek peace? When should we change our laws? When should we keep our laws the same? We could go on from here into all the different questions that politics touches upon. To make competent judgments about all those questions and many more is a very significant responsibility. And that's what I mean when I say that civic thought addresses a significant intellectual problem. So, second point, civic thought has a discernible center of inquiry and a way of relating to other modes of thought constitutive of the university. So it seems to me that the history, philosophy, practice of self-government is the core of something like civic thought. And then at a second level, you might get something like the question of human flourishing, not quite the same thing as how we ought to govern ourselves, particularly in the American context, which I should have mentioned earlier, which is dead center of things, but obviously closely related to all that. And then at a third level, at the periphery of civic thought, as I see it, you'd see the way that this particular mode of thinking relates to all the other modes of thinking that the university cultivates. So, for example, civics and politics touch on both science and the arts. You can see this right now in the sense that we are having a controversy over the Trump administration's cuts to funding at the National Institutes for Health, which touches on science, of course, and at the National Endowment for the Humanities, which touches on the humanities. So if I'm going to be a citizen who cultivates his awareness of all the things upon which I'm called to have a judgment about, I got to know, what's poetry? And why should my government take any interest in it? What's science? And why do we fund that? So that doesn't mean becoming a scientist or becoming a poet, which is what it would mean to go into those modes of thinking, properly speaking. But it does mean having some literacy with respect to them and relating to the other parts of the cultivation of intellectual excellence that goes on at the university. Okay, so we've got but civic thought has a distinctive center and a periphery that allows it to relate to the other things that go on in the university. Third, civic thought has a distinctive approach to the problem that it takes up. As I understand it, the civic thinker is a disciplined generalist. So if you think about this, our civic responsibilities are comprehensive rather than specific. which is why civic thinking is a general mode of thinking rather than a form of specialized expertise. But the citizen is not undisciplined, although he is a generalist, and I've been a generalist all my life, and we're always charged with being undisciplined, and it's sometimes fair. But the citizen, in particular, is disciplined by the citizen's particular question, which Peter Levine has really nicely formulated as, what should we do? And I'm going to put the accent on the last word of that, do. Civic thought is thought about action, about particular courses of conduct that we might plausibly take. That disciplines it. It pulls it away from determinism, things are the way they are, we can't do anything about it, on the one hand, and utopianism, this is how we'd like things to be, but we can't possibly get there, on the other. The ancients called this particular form of excellence prudence, or practical wisdom, and I think that's the specific intellectual excellence at which civic thought ought to aim. So an example can illustrate the substance of this way of thinking and the contribution it might make. So during a broad political crisis, such as we endured during the COVID-19 pandemic, decision makers are going to want to consult with a broad range of experts without simply leaving the decisions in the hands of those experts. So if you think about something like the COVID crisis, you obviously want to know what the epidemiologists have to say, you want to know about what the economists have to say about courses of action you might take, you want to talk to constitutional lawyers. But then you have to make decisions, and we as citizens ultimately are the arbiters of decisions, about comprehensive courses of action that touch on all of that stuff. And that's why you can't simply farm out your intelligence to this or that expert. So there is generalist thinking is often criticized in the university and for certain reasons because it can be dilettantish. But the fact is we're called upon to do it all the time. We constantly have to make comprehensive judgments, both in our private lives and in our political lives, and we could use a university discipline that is dedicated to helping us develop that particular faculty. Fourth, there are a specific set of intellectual skills that developing that kind of competence entails. First, the elements of prudent deliberation, the identification of the ends that we're going to try to seek together, the identification of the proper means to those ends once we've decided upon them, the weighing of evidence, the sorting of information from misinformation, so that our courses of action may be evidence-based. I think that's one of the places where social science has a powerful contribution to make to civic thought. We've got to practice civic conversation, deliberation, through the kinds of practices that John Rose and others have described for us today. Civic thought should include the development of rhetoric, as Tom Cleveland was pointing out just a little while ago, a very well-developed art, but which we have somehow come to neglect. And because prudence can never be learned from academic study alone, civic thought should be engaged with practice. I think it should require internships of its students and bring practitioners from outside of academic life into the classroom. So it's got a distinct set of skills that we can find ways to cultivate. Fifth, and here I want to distinguish, respond to some of the questions that Lee specifically posed. Civic thought is not the same thing as political science, although I think it could be friends with political science and learn from political science. Jim Stoner has written a really fantastic paper in the magazine National Affairs that deals with this subject. I commend that to you all. But I just want to summarize 2 points that Jim makes there. One, what's the difference between a civic thinker and a political scientist? The civic thinker thinks as a responsible insider, right? I'm taking ownership for this project of self-government that we're all engaged in. Whereas a scientist always seeks to look at things from the outside, right, as a dispassionate observer. So in that sense, the two perspectives are distinct. On the other hand, a civic thinker can learn from what political scientists discover by adopting that point of view. For example, take the case of of public opinion research that political scientists are so good at, knowing my fellow citizens are here on such and such an issue. That's a really important fact that I ought to take stock of in attempting to make prudent deliberations. And so civic thought is not the same thing as political science, but it can learn from political science. Sixth, civic thought is, this is the question with respect to interdisciplinarity. Civic thought seems to me to be intimately tied to other disciplines. And as you can note, the people who are populating these schools, they have been drawn from a bunch of other disciplines. But it is not simply interdisciplinarity. And I think the reason it's not simply interdisciplinarity is because, again, interdisciplinarity is rightly charged sometimes with being dilettantish. And I say this as somebody who's a graduate of the Committee on Social Thought, has been dealing with that charge my entire adult life. But if it's true that civic thinking is the self-conscious cultivation of prudence in the way that I've attempted to describe, it's got a center of gravity. And it's got a way of disciplining itself that can relieve it of that charge of dilettantism. And finally, I think civic thought can develop its own characteristic mode of scholarship. The citizen's vocation is to speak to the public. So civic thought scholarship should be, in my view, public-facing. It can, at the same time, be deeply informed and rigorous. Now, I find a model for how these things can be combined in some of my colleagues, my predecessors at the American Enterprise Institute. So I look at people like Yuval Levin, Nick Eberstadt, and Irving Kristol. Like, look, these guys were and are exceedingly serious students of all the subjects they address in their scholarship, and yet they demand of themselves that they write books that any intelligent undergraduate could read and would enjoy reading. I think that's a kind of discipline that civic thinkers would do well to impose upon themselves. So I hope that schools of civic thought can become nursing beds of that kind of scholarship, and I think more of that kind of scholarship could do a lot to help universities deal with the crisis of public trust that others have referred to today, in a way that would be that would allow schools of civic thought to make a really positive contribution to their institutional homes.
Thank you, Ben. This is fun. For those of you who have never been to an economics seminar, I'm going to try to drop a little grenade and then see what happens. But so my short answer to the question of whether we should establish civic thought as a new academic discipline is no. However, that response, while direct, risks sounding overly pessimistic. So it requires some clarification and refinement. I have two primary concerns with the designation civic thought as a standalone discipline. First is the issue of the name itself. Civic thought sounds more like a subfield than a full academic discipline. Perhaps unintentionally, the term implies a constrained methodological approach, one that leans heavily towards theory, while implicitly excluding other methods such as empirical or quantitative social science. So when considering the formation of something new in this space, I would argue that civics is a more encompassing name. My second concern relates to the distinction between an academic discipline and a field of study. In my view, civics should be considered opposite of what we just heard, a multidisciplinary field of study rather than a distinct discipline. Faculty within civic programs should draw on from a wide variety of disciplines, such as, and I'll say in no particular order, economics, government, philosophy, history and law, and others, each of which brings unique insights to the study of civic life and democratic institutions. As the civic movement gains momentum, we should take note of lessons from similar multidisciplinary endeavors. And in my case, I'm familiar with public policy. Though for the record, I'm not sure whether public policy views itself as a discipline or merely a field of study. Regardless, there are now about 85 schools of public policy offering PhD programs. Yet an examination of their faculty shows that a vast majority do not hold PhDs in public policy. For example, at the UT Austin LBJ School, Turns out, I looked last night, 25 of the 30 tenured and tenure-track faculty at LBJ have earned their doctorates in fields other than public policy. Similarly, I've often noticed that job candidates from institutions like the Harvard Kennedy School will list their degree as PhD in public policy, followed immediately by a parenthetical note such as economics track. To me, this suggests that public policy, at least in its current form, is not a discipline in the traditional sense. After all, no other recognized discipline that I am aware of depends heavily on other disciplines to train the majority of their faculty. I expect a similar pattern would emerge in civics 50 years from now. I don't envision schools of civic education, as we call it at UT, being primarily staffed by faculty with PhDs in civics. More likely, they will continue to be drawn on faculty trained in foundational disciplines I mentioned earlier. Finally, I believe the civics movement should adopt one of the key institutional innovations that have helped legitimize the field of public policy, the formation of a professional society and a peer-reviewed academic journal. For public policy, this happened in 1979 with the creation of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, also known as APAM, and the launch of a Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, JPAM, in 1981. So with that in mind, I propose that we start laying the groundwork for an analogous institution, perhaps with the help of the Jack Miller Center. We could call it the American Civics Association, along with scholarly outlets such as the American Civics Journal. The journal would be devoted to the multidisciplinary study of civic life, examining the rights, responsibilities, and roles of citizens in the workings of government and political systems. And to note, I nominate Jenna Storey, since she's not here, and Ben as the inaugural co-presidents of the new association. Their thoughtful leadership and commitment to civic education make them ideal candidates to help shape the direction and values of this endeavor. Thank you. My boss, Justin Dyer, and he declined, so I went to
Roosevelt.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. I've gotten quite an education over the course of the day today. It's been enormously edifying for me. So thank you all for putting it together and putting it together so well. You can, I think all of us can appreciate how difficult it is to make some big event like this run smoothly, flawlessly as this one has. There have been several threads of conversations playing themselves out throughout the day, and I want to align my remarks with a thread that I want to point out that in the first panel, Susan McWilliams-Brandt sort of represented, and you might remember her talking about how I'm going to read this quote, our dignity requires us to quarrel with being taught. She spoke about teaching through indirection, and it's one of the things that concerns me about thinking of civic thought as a distinct instructional area. What we want, the problem that we're facing of civic life and civic engagement, of civic commitment in our population, to what extent can that actually be addressed by studying civic life and civic thought? In your own experience, does the study of moral philosophy produce moral virtue? Do political scientists make good politicians or even citizens? Are economists rich? So I think those are questions we have in mind, and you know, in the second panel that I want to associate Susan's intervention with John Rose's interventions and in the second panel, and I was quite struck by his sense that civil discourse is something that is achieved by building trust, building community, building solidarity, not achieved by studying the features and characteristics and mechanics of civil discourse. And in the last panel, Brian Garston and Melinda Zook also both expressed the same, sort of the same thread there. What the problem that we need to address about civic virtue, civic participation, and civic commitment cannot be addressed by a major in civic thought and cannot be addressed by a school of civic thought. That is, we must not think of civic education as a discipline and a track among others. We cannot think about civic education as one school among others. What are we going to do with the person who doesn't major in civic thought, who majors in engineering, which is going to be the majority of our student body is not going to major in civic thought. What are we going to do about the student that goes to the School of the Arts or the School of pre-professional studies in whatever field, or the School of Liberal Arts rather than the School of Civic Thought? We mustn't delude ourselves to think that we are addressing the problem simply by establishing these specialized tracks and specialized forms of study of that. And what I want to say today most emphatically is that to address this problem in higher education, we need to address general education. That is, we need to address that part of the curriculum that lies outside the major and which every student has to fulfill. That needs to be our ambition. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have a school of civic thought, and that's not to say that we shouldn't have a major in civic thought, and that's not to say that civic thought should not be an academic discipline. For God, crying out loud, we have ethnic studies, we have Dominican studies, and I'm Dominican. You go to City College, you can go to the center of you get Dominican studies, right? Sure, we can have civic thought as an academic discipline, but the danger that it represents is that we confuse it with this fundamental issue and fundamental problem that we have, which of course can not only be addressed by higher education, it's got to be addressed in the K through 12 space. It's got to be truly democratic, truly universal. But in higher education, at the very least, since we are in higher education, our contribution to that civic education has to happen in the general education space, which in our colleges and universities, for the most part, general education has been extinguished, has been disappeared, has been strangled by the exclusive dominance of disciplinary study. General education in most schools means that you take 3 courses in the humanities and 2 in the social sciences and 1 with quantitative reasoning and 1 with an emphasis on writing, and you've got general education. You took 3 English classes or 3 social science classes. That is the opposite of general education. And we as institutions have evaded our responsibility to educate generally our students, because it's just easier to farm out our students into existing disciplines, existing departments, existing faculty lines, and then repackage it and call it a general education. It is not a general education. It is not a liberal education. Liberal education has been strangled out of the curriculum by the dominance of disciplinary specialization. The Cornerstone program that Melinda talked about at Purdue is one extraordinarily successful model of pushing back against that. Some schools, like Stanford's first-year seminar, is doing that. A really remarkable achievement, what Stanford did. And other schools, Vanderbilt it's in a similar direction. Other schools have been adopting models like this. There are about 70 schools now that have programs that have been modeled on Purdue's Cornerstone program. And it seems to me that we need to focus serious attention and serious effort into reforming general education as the way to address the civic crisis. I want to describe really quickly what, in my view, are 4 fundamental characteristics of the type of general education course that does this deep civic education. One is a commonality of intellectual experience. We as a faculty have the responsibility to present to our students a recent, defensible account of what things are most worth knowing. What books, what debates, what conversations are most fundamental. We need to commit ourselves to some, not final, not ultimate, not eternal, not perfect, but a defensible, provisional accounting of that captures our collective learning, that captures our collective commitment, and that approximates what we can achieve as a consensus among our faculty of what those things are. Now, that's a hard conversation, as Brian said when in his experience of working a curriculum. They're very intense debates, but they're also extraordinarily instructive. And it's the kind of debate that we don't tend to have in faculty discussions. What should the student, the first-year student, learn? Not about American intellectual history, not about American political thought, which is what I teach, right? Not about economics, not about science, not about American literature, not about English literature. What should that student know? We need to engage, we need to create in our faculty that conversation. So of course, any list that we come up with is gonna be problematic by definition. Stephanie was talking about how in her program she's sort of considering that, but I think the way she put it is, I'm not there yet, and part of the problem is that the lists that usually characterize gen ed curricula, great books, canonical lists, leave a lot of stuff out. They're by definition, they're exclusive. You leave almost everything out. But if we think that the lists that we have are not inclusive, let's make it more inclusive. Let's have the debates. And there are good reasons why you want to have a list in an American university that favors the Western tradition of discourse and debate, and that has shaped our institutions and our norms and our ethical categories. But there are also good arguments why that is not enough, why we are increasingly in a globally integrated world. Let's have those arguments, but let us commit ourselves to, in general education, present the student with one version of a coherent, systematic, and hierarchically organized account of what is most worth knowing. What are those debates and ideas and texts and skills that every student ought to have in common? So that's the first characteristic, commonality of intellectual experience. Then I think that liberal education, which in my view is another name for deep civic education. It's about being free, it's about self-governance, it's about managing your own sovereignty and your collective sovereignty. That form of education has to be done in small, discussion-driven classes. The debates, the conversations, looking at one another in the eye, having real, spontaneous, open-ended discussions, not following a script, not delivering a predetermined rubric of knowledge that you as a professor are going to ensure that they master, but really having the debates, the conversations under real stimulation, real provocations in a small discussion-based class. So that's the second characteristic, commonality, small discussion-based seminars. Third, there has to be non-disciplinary courses. The human questions, as Ben and Jenna explained beautifully in that paper, the human questions that we deal with are not within the confines of any particular discipline. It can't be an English course, it can't be a history course, it can't be a political science course. It's got to be a course that is pre-disciplinary, that abides in the ground from which all of those disciplines come, which means that it's not going to be just the English professor or the history professor or the philosophy professor or the political science professor. All of those professors are going to have a thing to contribute and are going to need to be part of this endeavor, because there we're teaching the engineer, we're teaching the future entrepreneur, we're teaching the future lawyer, the future doctor. We're teaching them not to be political scientists like I am or an American historian like I am. We're teaching them about how to be a citizen, about how to live an active, engaged life in a self-governing community. So commonality, discussion-based, non-disciplinarity. And the third thing is that the content matters. These courses ought to be organized around primary fundamental texts. And by a text, it doesn't need to be a book, art and music and scientific discoveries, but primary material that illuminate our human experience, that illuminate our problems, and that help us understand with some kind of historical depth and historical awareness the origin, genesis, and evolution of the questions with which we grapple today. One last thing I want to say, one of the reasons I'm here and what I have found this so instructive is because I've been at Columbia my entire adult life. I went there as a student, as an undergraduate student when I was 18, and I never left. I've been teaching for now more than 25 years at Columbia. This is my last semester at Columbia, so I'm moving to Bard College, where I will inaugurate an as of yet unofficial, not officially announced, so this is not an official announcement I'm making, but going to inaugurate a Center for Liberal Education and Civic Life. And the mission of the center is going to be to promote this kind of general education reform. Liberal education and civic life. How do you do that? How do you catalyze and foment and support gen ed reform? I will welcome your ideas and your thoughts about it. The one thing that we know we need is to train faculty in how to do this. Faculty are trained in their specialty. They're have an identity of expertise, and I teach Plato, I teach Shakespeare, I teach Augustine, I teach Aquinas, I teach Aristotle, and I wasn't trained in graduate school to do any of that. I had to sort of learn it by being part of this particular culture in the Columbia core curriculum where all of those things are taught. So one of the things that the center is going to do is hold institutes and seminars to bring faculty together and equip them to do this kind of teaching. So that's a clear part of what we're going to do. We're also going to house the high school programs, of which Brian's program at Yale is an example, and at Columbia there's a freedom and citizenship program. Same model, bring in high school students for a residential experience, reading what you might call great books or fundamental works or primary works or transformative texts, equipping them for citizenship, helping them get into college. There are now over 30 programs like that nationally. Last year we had a gathering of those programs at Yale that Brian and his team hosted. It was a really extraordinary gathering. So that this center at Bard is going to bring together those high school programs and also work on expanding and supporting them. But what do we do? In a way, that center is going to be a think tank to learn about and enact, catalyze this kind of gen ed reform. That's our purpose. So it's one other sort of track and one other approach at addressing this problem of civic education, but one that takes aim at this aspect of the American bachelor's degree curriculum that's there for the taking, which is the general education aspect of every bachelor's degree, and that is where this kind of liberal and civic education needs to happen. Thank you.
Russell? Thanks. My name's Russ Muirhead, and I teach at Dartmouth College. I'll try to say something about civic thought in relation to political science, your question, Ben, in relation to economics and the disciplines, and also in relation to these questions, Roosevelt, that you raise about what it means to live and to die, what it means to be a human being, the most profound questions that I think are actually the questions that people, the age of our students, are in a way most open to and most keen to engage. And maybe by asking, I'd like to make a claim about what the job of civic thought is. And in contrast to, well, say politics. I mean, if you look at the periodic table of academic disciplines, you will find politics on that table. So why not just have civic thought be a subfield, so to speak, of politics, or so-called political science? politics as a thing, phenomena or just a thing, arises from the fact that human beings have to cooperate in order to thrive, probably in order to survive. And that the terms of their cooperation do not come into being on their own. Ants, I think, do not argue about which ant should be queen or whether they should have a queen. It seems like that they're social and or at least they're cooperative, but the terms of their cooperation seem to come into being on their own. Whereas in human communities, we argue, we contest the terms of social cooperation. Should you be queen? Why shouldn't I be queen? Do we really even need to have a queen? And so, it turns out that, you could think that this argument might just simply be settled by force. And certainly the stakes are high. In the Schmittian terms, to rule is to oppress. And so whether you're oppressed or you get to oppress is pretty important. And people will try to gather resources that give them physical strength and allow them to oppress rather than being oppressed. It turns out that it's almost impossible to ever be strong enough to stabilize a ruling order. And that in addition to all of the fearsome techniques of violence that human beings have been able to amass, they also have to use words in order to get power and keep power. You have to convince at least someone else that you deserve to have it. Maybe not everyone else. And so that's why words matter. Argument, logos matters. That's how political thought arises. And it will arise wherever there are human beings. So politics will arise wherever there are human beings. And is that also, civic thought, political thought? Political thought is thought about who should rule, how and what for. And why not just leave it then? Why not leave political thought, or civic thought, to politics? It's part of the job of politics, political science, the study of politics. And I think that there are a few reasons why not to leave this to just political science. As it's institutionally established, we have a wonderful annual meeting. 7,000 or 8,000, sometimes 10,000 political scientists running loose in the city of Chicago, for 4 or 5 days, Washington, D.C. It's really fun.
Now you know where the corruption comes from. That it's
Yeah. One reason not to leave it to political science is that political science does not teach politics. I started the thing at Dartmouth called Political Economy Project with a fellow economist because we were like after, the financial crisis, like, economics teaches nothing about market society and its fundamental alternatives. You want to know how to build a model of refrigerator pricing, major in economics. And if you want to understand the world, no. In political science, we teach applied statistics about whatever. If you want to understand, constitutional democracy and fundamental alternatives to it, there's a course here or there that might touch on that, but not really political science. So the big questions that citizens are asked to answer they're not really educated to understand in these disciplines. That's why we created this little center at Dartmouth to try to engage those big questions. I think a lot of my colleagues they don't believe in educating, they believe in training. They train students to be political scientists. 1 in 1,000 of our majors becomes a political scientist, maybe 1 in 5,000, God help them. But but that's the whole job of our major, even though that's not what our majors actually do. So it's not teaching politics, maybe it should. Political science, as you mentioned, it sees political regimes as systems. That's often the word. You use the term in your essay that we read. I think you should stop using it. Political system. Politics isn't a system. A system is kind of a self-regulating, self-maintaining machine that runs itself. And political regimes are orders if they're stable. And they're ordered, they're stabilized by beliefs, by a phrase that was used this morning, it's just right, habits of the heart and habits of the mind that induce people citizens, let's call them, to give more than they get on occasion. Not in some self-sacrificial way all the time, although I think sometimes it's in a very self-sacrificial way, but most of the time in ways that they don't even realize, if the habits are well-formed, they're not even thinking economistically and about whether they're getting more than they give or giving more than they get. They developed a large sensibility of themselves and their sense of responsibility, as Tocqueville says, and they understand their self-interest in this enlarged way. So that's what's required to stabilize. It's not a system. And that's the way you want to think about it if you want to be scientific, because as you said, political scientists, they, just like physics is the same in India as it is in Europe as it is in the US, political science should be the same everywhere. Civic thought isn't going to be the same everywhere. The civic thought of India or the EU or the US is going to be, and that gets to this third thing that I think political science and the university in most of my career has abdicated the political trust placed in it, that it's been charged with carrying. It's given up any kind of patriotic mission or sense of service, if you don't like the word patriotism, sense of service to the country. The institutions that I've been employed by most of my career have been happy to think of themselves as serving the globe. They've been happy to think of themselves as serving a variety of different causes, but they would be profoundly embarrassed to think of themselves as serving their country. And I think, civic thought is the job of civic thought, in contrast to political science, is to serve the country. It's in this way, not in a stupefying way, in the it's not to learn a catechism of patriotic devotion. That's not civic thought. Civic thought is more like where it starts. So civic thought starts in a community, in a particular community. Political thought could just start in the phenomena, the thing of politics that I described at the beginning. It could apply to any politics, but civic thought has to start in a place, and its starting point, isn't a place, and it takes its task from that place. And so I think the task of civic thought in the United States now arises from what the United States Constitution asks of Americans, and from the incredible difficulty that Americans are experiencing in offering what the Constitution asks of them. So the Constitution of the United States offers a mode of rule that ideally, Josh, isn't experienced as Schmittian rule. A mode of rule, as you're pointing out, in which no one is oppressed. So you could almost say it's a rule in which no one rules. It's an order in which no one rules. I think that's, you could literally say that. And part of that's bargaining and the different virtues that you're describing. Part of it, you could describe it also as a way of coming together. The Constitution, in order to rule, there's a we who rules in the Constitution. The first subject of the Constitution is we. That's the first word in the preamble. And if you just diagram the preamble, which is one sentence, people don't learn cursive anymore. They don't learn multiplication tables anymore. But Mrs. Kelly in Hillside Junior High School taught me how to diagram sentences, another thing my teenagers don't know how to do. But if you look at it, we do is what it is. We do. We do ordain. And we want to do a bunch of other things. Like in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty. So we want to, form and establish and provide for and promote and secure. We want to do all these things. We want to do these. In order to be this empowered we have to come together. We have to constitute ourselves in a way the Constitution asks us to, which is to constitute ourselves in a very, very large group, not just a bare majority, not the kind of 30%, was it 34% that elected the Labor Party majority in Parliament last summer? Amazing fact that they convert a minority of the vote into this supermajority in Parliament. The Constitution doesn't do that, and it doesn't allow Americans to do that. You have to have a big majority. It has to stay together for more than one election day. You know, it's not like in the New Hampshire Constitution, every public official is elected every 2 years. It's a real anti-federalist constitution. In the United States of America, as you well know, you know, it's only a third of the Senate that comes up in any cycle. And the president is on a 4-year cycle. So that majority has to hold itself together for years. It has to be lasting. It has to be large. It has to be lasting. It has to be geographically dispersed. Everybody hates the U.S. Senate. But it's a dispersion principle. It says that the majority has to be spread out across space. So it has to be large, lasting, geographically dispersed. There's a temporal element, geographic element, a numeric or size element. That's the way you rule. And there have been a few, political entrepreneurs that have been able to build that kind of coalition that makes the Constitution work. TJ did it. Thomas Jefferson, AJ did it. Andrew Jackson. Lincoln did it. FDR did it. But in my entire life, since the day I was born, nobody's been able to do it. And they haven't been able to do it, in my opinion, because at the very moment we decide to take racial equality seriously, the very moment that we say we will no longer be unified and make this Constitution work at the price of being tolerating apartheid and systematic disenfranchisement and the terrorization of a racial minority. We will no longer do that. Once Johnson passes the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and you know the story, the apocryphal story, Bill Moyers walks into his office, I think it's after the Voting Rights Act, and says, "Why are you looking so glum? You just passed the most important piece of legislation since the 15th Amendment." And he says, "I've just destroyed the Democratic coalition." Huh. And a coalition of Southern whites and Southern whites who are in the Democratic Party because Lincoln fought the war. So from the moment we take racial equality and racial justice seriously, we can no longer build the kind of majority we need. And of course, to build, at that time, you might have said a biracial republic of equals. Now, it would be a multiracial, diverse republic of equals. That we have proved incapable of doing. And so we need a civic thought, I think, that starts from that problem to help us paint a picture, if you will, of the community in which we can each as individuals see ourselves, recognize ourselves, but also see us belonging to the whole. And to paint that picture will require these resources of historians, of economists, of poets, of musicians, maybe most of all, I agree with that, of philosophers. And so I think that's the task of civic thought for us now.
I think you will, yes, thank you. But I have to say I'm painfully aware of being the last speaker. And so many really good ideas have already been presented, not just in this session, but all day. But then also I'm painfully aware of the fact that I stand between you and a few questions and drinks. So I'll try to keep these remarks brief. I want to also, as everyone else has, thank Jeremy and Lee for the invitation to come here, Heather and the staff here for making just a wonderful event for all of us. And then I'd like to thank Ben and Jenna Storey for writing their essay. In my time, I'd like to address some of their points and really try to make the argument that we can be capacious in our interpretation of what sort of centers offer civic thought education. I'll talk a little bit about my experience, then a bit more about the article itself, and then come back to the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. So I'm the dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, something that was an experiment about 35 years ago, the first undergraduate school devoted to the study of leadership in the United States. So that's part of my experience. Within that school, I also have created, with some colleagues, supported and kind of nurtured what is now an institute that is named for a distinguished political scientist and legal scholar, chief speechwriter for Ed Meese, Gary McDowell. And that institute, which is named for Gary, upholds his vision of encouraging civil discourse across ideological and political divides. 18 years later, it too has some staying powder. So Jepson is 35 years old almost, and this institute is also has managed to live on for a couple of decades. The school itself was born amidst some controversy. It made the Wall Street Journal, of which Bob Jepson constantly reminds me, like, I don't want to end up in the Wall Street Journal again, 35 years later. I arrived at it in 2007, so I've been a dean for a long time. I was hired in as the dean at the University of Richmond. They told me, and I believed, that there were I'm the fourth dean of the school. So I thought, okay, well, like that's about 4 years, and I'm tenured, but I serve at the pleasure of the president and the board. So I got like 4 years to go. But of course, they didn't tell me that there were 3 or 4 interim deans also in that first 15 years. So it was just, a lot of churn. Now it's, so I've been there since 2007, so it's had quite a bit of stability. Waves of faculty have come and gone, so the sort of founding faculty have been replaced, and then the second wave that was brought in as endowed chairs, they too have retired and so on. We've been very successful at hiring assistants, assistant professors, and additional chairs. It's roughly, if you want to think of kind of disciplinarily situated, half in the humanities and half in social sciences. And it has civic engagement built into the curriculum. So much of what's been discussed has been a part of that school. I'm an economist of a certain tradition of economics, and this is going to bring me now to Ben's article. So I guess I would call myself a political economist, a historian of economics who's worked on Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and then jumped to the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek, and have a connection with Jim Buchanan, public choice, and then Vernon Smith, experimental economics. So that's the tradition, and I will say that in my view, that is a tradition in economics that is coherent. So the Storeys begin their article by suggesting that centers of the sort that they're describing need to create a mission statement, need to have some sort of coherence in terms of the curriculum and so on. And they use the word demanding, that the teaching and research needs to be demanding. First point I'd like to make is that when the Jepson School was created, there was a call for it to be rigorous. Anything new in academia, you need to prove your worth. And so I would second the notion of demanding. We at the Jepson School are now a little bit more self-confident. And so, for each course that we develop, we don't say, this is a rigorous course. However, 20, 25 years ago, we would have had to spend a lot of time convincing the experts at the University of Richmond that this was a curriculum worth defending. In addition, I'd like to suggest that the teaching and scholarship at a center of the sort that Ben and Jenna are describing should have a substantial political economy component. Why? Well, the Storeys in their article list issues such as taxation, education, the funding of public goods such as basic research, museums, literature, understanding mutual benefits that flow from exchange, and the presumptive costs associated with interruptions in trade, that is, due to tariffs. All of those, as I read the article, I wanted to jump up and start singing, although you wouldn't want to hear me do that. And then the Storeys also emphasize that there's a need to study human life, human nature, which Roosevelt has, talked about, and choices, and why choice matters. And again, I want to jump up and sing. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples that come from John Stuart Mill. You mentioned competent judges, so it's interesting that I would have chosen him. I could have chosen some others, but But you know, in the 19th century, as Mill looked at the very likely enlargement, significant enlargement of the franchise, for which he was advocating, you know, give women the right to vote, give the laboring classes the right to vote. And Adam Smith before him saw this as a, you know, an important coming political problem that needed to be addressed through civic education. And so Mill emphasized that education was needed alongside, if not in advance of, but certainly alongside of the enlargement of the franchise, so that people who needed to make, who were called upon to make political choices would have had the education that allowed them not to be bamboozled by politicians who promised them that if they entered into a collective action to raise their wages, that in fact, you know, so raising minimum wages, for instance, in fact, they weren't going to vote against their own self-interests. Mill, in his Logic, which is 1843, so long in advance of his political economy work, talks about how people, all of us, he's not just talking about the laboring classes, he says everyone is prone to believing, we are all prone to believing propositions that we want to be true. Wishing operates by making, as he puts it, a person look out eagerly for reasons or apparent reasons to support opinions which are comfortable to our interests or feelings. And then he goes on to say that, both in the Logic, but I think more powerfully when he's made rector of St. Andrews in 1867, he goes on to talk about how we can fortify our minds, he uses the word fortify our minds, by talking with, arguing with, listening to, and face-to-face is important, people who are different from us. And he uses the phrase, people who have different colored glasses in this speech upon the, as he was made the rector of St. Andrews. And it's very interesting that he uses the notion of glasses and color, because then almost 100 years later, well, 100 maybe 50 years later or so, somewhere around there, Jim Buchanan, Nobel laureate, will make a case not specifically invoking Mill, but talking about windows. And I've heard him use this metaphor many times about how when we as economists come together and have an argument, or we as philosophers, he was really sort of both, come together and want to have a discussion about some issue, we need to be able to look through different windows in order to try to imagine how the other person is viewing this, this argument or is making this argument. Of course, it goes back to Adam Smith, who, you know, has the principle of the impartial spectator, you know, in which he argues that the only way we can know what's in someone else's mind is by projecting ourselves onto the other person and viewing what we're doing through the other person's lens. Of course, that feeds into the notion of factions, which we started out with this morning. And Smith is important in the founding, so there's a connection there. But what Smith says is, as a correction to factions, we need competition. We need different points of views. We need points of views that are centered all in lots of different areas, so that we can break up the adherence to getting praise from only one particular faction or group that is most like us. Well, Mill, spoke with a lot of urgency when he writes in the 19th century, because he knows that the franchise is going to be enlarged, and of course it was. But he also talked about choice, which is another theme of Ben's article. And he doesn't talk about it in the way that Friedman talks about choice. So it's not an efficiency argument, that freedom of competition will allow prices to be driven to marginal cost and so on. It's not that at all. Why Mill is so thinks choice and sort of capacious living that involves people, all people, women as well as men, enslaved and formerly enslaved people as well as those who are free, must have the ability to make choices, because and this is it from On Liberty, it's only through making choices that we learn. Right? We learn to compare, we learn to discriminate, we learn to be responsible with the consequences of choice and so on. He makes perhaps I think the most powerful argument about why it's important for a free society, a self-governing society, for people in those societies to be able to make correct choices only through having grown up making various choices. And so I will just say that I think that's the type of political economy that I would like to see involved in or invoked in these centers. And I do think that it's important for these centers to have a place for the analysis of choice, the analysis of why speech is important, why more speech is the answer to speech, and so on. And I do think that it's important for a center of the sort that we're thinking of to have people from lots of different disciplines. I'm not sure whether there is a discipline of civics. And now I'll turn to the Jepson School again. We at the Jepson School have deliberately hired not people who have PhDs in leadership, although those exist. There are many, actually, institutions that offer PhDs in leadership of some sort, organizational leadership or whatever. But we hire political theorists, political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists. I'm an economist. We have English literature. We have religious study. We have history. We have philosophy. I'm probably missing something, but so the faculty come from lots and lots of different disciplines. Within leadership itself, there has been a long debate about, is there a discipline of leadership? Or, is it something sort of that you could finally say, okay, yes, there's a discipline. I have come to this by saying, or I have concluded that really it's a set of problems, and I think civics might be seen as a set of problems, and then you can bring your disciplinary lens to that set of problems. So I can address leadership thinking of collective action problems and experimental economics, and put a leader into an experiment and vary how the leader is selected and see whether that institutional change affects in a public goods game affects the effectiveness of the leader or not. But someone else, my colleague Kristen Bazzaio, who's a Shakespeare scholar, wants to teach about leadership on stage and screen, and she does so in a way that is perfectly coherent given her expertise and so on. And altogether, if you put all of the ways that we think about leadership together, we can, and I think you could kind of think about this in terms of civics as well. I think we can develop a program, a minor, a major, whatever, a gen ed, that is coherent, is rigorous, is demanding, that involves scholarship, and that challenges our students and makes them think deeply about questions that they're hungry to think about. So the last thing I'll say is that and this is especially, the example I'll use is the McDowell Institute. So that doesn't have a curricular element. It's all voluntary participation by students. But we had them read we had them read Monta's book, and they did it voluntarily. They enjoyed it. They loved meeting him and talking with him. And the program is just now growing sort of by word of mouth. And students will read things if they feel like these things are important, and they do. And they will put effort into things, even if there's no curricular element involved, it turns out. So I'm hopeful about the future of these centers.
That's great. Have you been dean since 2007?
Yes,
Oh my
yes,
gosh.
yeah.
Thank you to all our panelists. One of the questions I had before, or one of the hopes I had, was that we get a variety of different perspectives on the Storey proposal. I wanted to give Ben a brief moment, very brief, Ben, to be able to respond, because by my count, you don't have a majority of the panel on your side. And in particular, what I'd love to hear is, why is civic thought not a field of study similar to leadership? But feel free to take it whatever way you want.
Okay, so I think I can try to get. I heard three basic challenges that I want to try to respond to here in one capacious argument, but we'll see. Let me put this in historical terms. At the end of the 19th century, as you all know, the colonial college, which was the dominant model of American higher education up until that moment, was gradually displaced by the modern research university. The colonial college took it as one of its principal aims to cultivate people for positions of leadership. They sought to teach political prudence as a distinctive form of intellectual and moral excellence. The basic point of my argument is that that form of excellence is real, that it's not presently taught, not presently the focus of the other disciplines of the university that are closest to it. Second point, since that 19th century transformation, people like me who are in some ways unnerved by that transformation have, to put this bluntly, contented themselves with being second-class citizens of the university. What I mean by that is interdisciplinarity is great. I've been interdisciplinary all my life. I like it. But you know what? There are interdisciplinary programs here. There are interdisciplinary programs there. There's a philosophy department. There's a history department. There's a biology department. There's a math department at every university in the country. And there's a reason for that. And that's because the disciplines are the commanding high ground of the university. And so to all of you creating these programs, thinking about creating these programs, I encourage you to take the high ground. Do not walk around with a tin cup in your hand begging other disciplines to credential your people for the rest of your lives. And you have deep historical grounds for doing so. Think about the liberal arts as described by Cicero, which were exactly directed toward the cultivation of political prudence. That is a very storied tradition. It's not some fake thing that we're just making up in the 21st century. It is to some degree adapted to the environment of the modern university by being described as civic thought. But it's not some thing that is just dreamed up here and now and is likely to prove a flash in the pan. Last point with respect to this, to Roosevelt. Roosevelt's book, Rescuing Socrates, which I dearly love, and which it was a very profound experience for me to read, is in part an elegiac lament of the fact that general education requirements are the playthings of the research disciplines. So if you want to play with the big boys, and not content yourself to be a perpetual playthings of the research discipline, you got to have your own research discipline. And there's not really a tension between that and being in the gen eds. The math gen eds are not going anywhere. The science gen eds are not going anywhere because they have owners on the university campus, and those owners are the research discipline. So I encourage those who are interested in civic education to go that way.
That was a political argument for civics.
You got it.
This was just truly fantastic. Thank you so much. I think this is a question for Ben and Roosevelt. It's my impression that the overwhelming majority of students approach higher education with significant economic anxiety. I think the vast majority of them conceive of their agency in higher education through the idiom of their major. And I think this really impacts the enterprise of trying to do this work and where it would be located in a curriculum. And so I'm very curious what that means for the prospects of a major and how students would think about that as a curricular option. But then, of course, how it impacts institutions' priorities when it comes to supporting enterprises like general education, which, of course, if they're thinking in terms of majors, this is obvious how we've sort of ended up in this particular situation. But I'm curious, as you think about these values and these aims, how you just address this very dreary and unfortunate fact about where we're at.
Yeah. You want to go ahead?
I'll say quickly that one of the things I encounter constantly is a pervasive confusion or conflation of liberal education and a liberal arts major. People start talking about the one, and before they know it and you know it, they're talking about the other. And there's this confusion that to be liberally educated is to major in the liberal arts, right? If you get a liberal arts education or liberal education, that means you won't be able to get a job, that you will have no marketable skills, that you will have useless knowledge. So my discipline is in the humanities, my PhD is in English. I teach in the core curriculum and in American Studies at Columbia. And I go around and often make my humanities faculty colleagues upset when I explicitly say I'm not promoting the liberal arts major. That's not what there is no intrinsic good to be attained by having more and more liberal arts major. That's not the point. The point is to promote liberal education for everybody. So I think that once you disentangle liberal education from the major and say, if you want to be an engineer, be an engineer. If you want to be a business person, be a business person. If you want to be a doctor, be a doctor. The point is that, do you want to be a doctor or an engineer that also has this layer of exposure and training and awareness? Or do you want to be a doctor or an engineer that just knows the engineering and the physiology, et cetera? And the students, the families, the employers, everybody's going to say, no, we want the rounded one. But we have failed to create a curriculum that delivers that.
I can take a shot at this. One of the things that we found in talking with people about the term civic thought over the course of the last year is that it has legs with a lot of different audiences. Some of the new schools that have been developed that are developing this kind of university-level civic education have been extraordinarily successful in fundraising. The business community is interested in this language. We've found that it has legs with the political community. The people in politics are also attracted to this language. Find that it has legs with the young. When we try out the word civic thought with various groups of young people, they are interested in this if we explain what it is. So in this sense, I think there is some value to the language, and the value to the language is in part associated with the value of the specific intellectual contribution you're trying to make. Everybody knows we've got a civic problem in this country right now. Yeah. And everybody would like the skills to try to deal with it. An academic enterprise suited to do that is meeting a market need.
Susan?
I want to talk about a market problem. And that's that while I, in so many ways, celebrate the rather sudden rise of all these civic centers, the rise of all of these civic centers is absolutely cannibalizing my field of study in the discipline of political science. It's great to be a scholar of American political thought right now. There are more jobs than there ever have been. But more and more people in my field, and I'm thinking of people in this room, are leaving departments of political science to join civic schools. And the cumulative effect is that it is harder and harder for me, if I have a student who wants to study American political development or American political thought in graduate school, to find a place where they can go. It's almost impossible already, and I suspect that that problem is only going to accelerate. So, some of this conversation about the kind of disciplinary status of civic thought I take to be a kind of long-term conversation. But I'm really concerned about the problem that these schools are cannibalizing the very scholars out of the disciplines that can create new scholars for future civic endeavors. And I just like, as a practical matter, to hear some people reflecting on them. It strikes me as a big problem in the study of American political development and political thought and constitutional studies, I think, as Jerry mentioned earlier.
I'll speak as a non-political scientist, but been on the hiring end. We've had a massive hiring effort and trying to build a constitutional studies group. You're right. There's a dearth of faculty out there at UT Austin, where Justin Dyer was trained. All the faculty that he was trained under have recently retired, and so I think one of the focus we have is in the future is to develop co-curricular PhD programs to help provide education for those future scholars.
Yeah, I wonder if something that may be happening, and I say this just very hypothetically or just tentatively. As we know, in political science, political theory has been a kind of besieged and shrinking subfield. And in history departments, intellectual history or constitutional history, as Jeremy Bailey illustrated very powerfully, has been a shrinking and neglected and disappearing subfield. So I wonder if part of what's happening is that these particular subfields within traditional disciplines who have found themselves without a home in the dominant kind of center of gravity within the disciplines, a new thing is emerging that sort of brings them together. A new field, a new area is bringing, and I'm agnostic about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't have any particular investment in the survival of political science as a discipline, or in survival of English as a discipline. That's nothing wrong with them. I'm just saying I'm not. That's not a bone of contention in among my many bones of contention.
On this point, we wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education last summer called "Will Republicans Save the Humanities?" Intentionally cheeky title, and we began with just the numbers on how much hiring these schools are doing. The target audience of that publication was professors, deans in elite PhD producing institutions, so that they could take that article to their provosts, their deans, and say, hey, this is where the action is. This is where the growth areas are. I had a very interesting conversation the other day that suggests to me that this might be beginning to work, which is, this is the work that you all are doing, affecting the broader academy. I'm going to co-teach a course next spring with the chair of the Johns Hopkins Political Science Department, who's a wonderful guy named Robbie Shilliam, who is a post-colonialist Rastafarian. And so Robbie is not, he doesn't come from the same political tribe I do, let's put it this way. He says to me in the course of our development of this course, he's looking around and he's saying, these new schools are the only growth area that's out there. And so, Susan, I totally understand your question. I agree with others that, look, American political thought didn't have a future anyway. Now it might. This is, yes, it's creative destruction. And creative destruction is, there's always some pain to that. But I think I think the upside is worth it because the downside was pretty down.
Yeah. Well, first, just a quick comment on this. I think anybody listening today would think American political thought and American institutionalism is very important to this business, but it's by no means the only thing. I mean, consider political economy or British intellectual history or lots of other things we've heard about. So maybe one thing to take away is can you be cannibalizing from other departments into political science? But the main But the main thing I wanted to do was make a different case for Ben, because I want Ben to win and get more of the, I'm rooting for him and I want him to get at least 3 votes so he can win the majority. And so he made a political case for the discipline, which I do agree with, but I wanted to make a more principled one, which is just a distinction between, so we want everybody, not only every undergraduate, but every American to have the civic learning experiences that Roosevelt you talked about, or to go back to the beginning of the day, like what they should all take John's course. But at the same time, there's a bunch of quite advanced and specialized questions that are meta questions about that sort of thing. So if we take John's course and if we take dialogue and deliberation to be part of what democratic citizens do, and I don't think it's by any means the only thing, but if we take them to be one of those questions, every student should do some dialogue and deliberation in an appropriate setting. But there's also a whole bunch of questions that are psychological, normative, historical and otherwise about dialogue and deliberation, its role, how to think about it, et cetera, pedagogical. And the people who study that, to me, are the discipline of civic studies. So that's or civic thought. That's the more advanced sort of back end. It's the R&D for civics. And it's not just about dialogue and deliberation. It's about a lot of things, including constitutional law and other things. So I'll just say that's sort of how we think of it at Tufts, where it's called civic studies. So that means that so we have about 50 majors in civics studies, and the argument against having just 50 majors is what about the other few thousand students? But our 50 majors are the ones who get intrigued by the meta questions at an advanced level, the sort of seriously unanswered questions. So how do you do dialogue in a world in which TikTok is powerful? That becomes a research question and an analytic question. And so I think and I would argue, I think Ben and Jenna have already argued it, but that's a hole in the disciplinary constellation, certainly to be informed by the various disciplines, but a hole because the questions that they ask are not quite the right questions to answer them. So that would be so it's a division of labor. So Gen Ed, yes, but the department is providing the advanced kind of R&D for thinking about how to do what's done in the Gen Ed curriculum.
Were we voting? I don't know how I voted. How did I vote?
I think
You voted.
The election hasn't quite.
Peter said he wanted Ben to win, but I would go with Josh and say that we need the Nash bargaining solution. So.
My vote had a hanging Chad.
So we're just about at our time. I wanted to thank everybody for coming from near and far. My day in and day out job does not involve these kind of rich conversations, so I was really looking forward to it, and it was not disappointing. I learned so much today, and I wanted to just spend a few moments thanking some of the key personnel who helped make today's wonderful event possible. So Jeremy Fortier, he was the person who put all the work into organizing it. Thank you, Jeremy. And then Heather and Molly were the logistical support for today's event. And please mark your calendars. We have April 24th of next year as the next second annual Civic Symposium. It's the 4th Friday in April, which is what this Friday is as well. We'd love to have you all back again. We hope to have even more people. We'll get the air conditioner working next time. And so our next up is the cocktail right outside the door, right, Heather? Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming.